Good evening, people of Mount Zion and beyond. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday night Bible study as we wind down in kind of the home stretch of this pandemic period. We have been picking up these Wednesday night Bible studies exactly where we left off and running through them pretty much exactly the way we ran them before. What we've been doing is tracing through the main themes of the Bible very slowly, just a few passages at a time. We've been kind of loosely using the New Hampshire Confession of Faith. That is an old Baptist doctrinal statement from the early 1800s as a general guide, and we've been looking closely at the passages of Scripture that it cites as a way to really get our heads around how the Bible speaks into our lives. And so, picking it back up where we left off, we are looking at the New Hampshire Confession of Faith. It says, and I quote, "We believe that such only are real believers as endure unto the end, that their persevering attachment to Christ is the grand mark which distinguishes them from superficial professors, that a special providence watches over their welfare, and that they are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation." One of the passages that the New Hampshire Confession is drawing from here is Matthew chapter 13, verses 20 and 21. That is Matthew chapter 13, verses 20 and 21, where Jesus says that the seed sown on rocky ground, this is one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet has no root in himself, but is short-lived. So when pressure or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he stumbles. This passage is probably pretty familiar. It's from the parable of the seeds and the sower here in Matthew 13. Jesus talks about the sower who sows his seeds on the road and in the rocks and on the good soil. The seed that he sows on the road never takes root. They just bake in the sun and they die. That's a metaphor for people who hear the gospel and reject it. He also talks about the seed that he sows on the good soil. That's a metaphor for people who hear the gospel and accept it and then allow it to take hold of their lives and transform them. But here Jesus is talking about a third kind of seed. He's talking about the seed that lands on the shallow ground, the seed that lands among the rocks, on the rocky ground, among the thorns and the thistles. Jesus says the seed sown on rocky ground, this is one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but is short-lived. When pressure or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he stumbles. And this is a metaphor for the person who hears the gospel and responds positively to it at first. So you accept the gospel, at least in theory. Maybe you walk down the aisle when you're 7 after VBS or something, or maybe you marry into the Christian faith. You have to convert or else your girl won't accept your ring. So you convert to the faith, you accept the gospel message in theory at first. But then difficulty comes. That can look like a lot of things. Maybe you lose your job, or maybe you have difficulty getting pregnant, or you get sick, or you get priced out of your apartment and you lose your home. The list goes on. Things start to go bad for you. Your luck turns around, and not in a good way. And because things have taken a turn for the worse, you start to doubt that God really cares about you. Or you start to doubt that He even exists. And then you start to think about things you'd like to do that God tells you not to do, right? For most folks, it has to do with sex-related stuff. If I didn't believe in Jesus, I could have sex with my girlfriend. without feeling bad about it. Or maybe it has to do with money. If I didn't believe in Jesus, I wouldn't have to pay my employees a living wage like the Bible tells me to. Or if I didn't believe in Jesus, I wouldn't have to give part of my income to the church. Or if I didn't believe in Jesus, I wouldn't have to suck it up and be nice to my annoying neighbor or my nosy coworker, and so on and so forth. And what happens a lot of times is that the more we realize that we want to do things that God tells us not to do, the more convincing we find our doubts. Right? The more we recognize that we want to do things that God tells us not to do, the more convincing we find our doubts. The more convincing we find arguments against God's existence or against the trustworthiness of the Bible. You will never find your doubt more convincing than when you want to disobey God's law. You will never doubt God more than when you want to disobey Him. And so when difficulty comes, it chokes out whatever belief you might have had. But sometimes it's more serious than that. Because Jesus says when pressure or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he stumbles. So it's not just bad luck. It's not just struggles. It's not just trials. Sometimes it's persecution. Sometimes it's persecution that comes because of your faith specifically. Maybe you've seen that movie Silence. It's got Liam Neeson. It's about a group of missionaries in Japan who are persecuted because of their faith. It's probably the best movie about persecution towards Christians that I've ever seen, at least. But sometimes persecution comes. In some places in the Middle East, churches are regularly burned and Christian women are regularly assaulted and children are taken away from Christian parents. The list goes on. The same is true in some parts of Africa and some of the remote mountain regions in Latin America. But here in the Western world, we don't have anything quite like that. But sometimes you might face small-scale, isolated incidents of persecution. You may have a boss who doesn't like you because you're a Christian, or you may have an in-law who treats you and your spouse poorly because of your faith, or you may not get certain promotions depending on your city. Your school system might have a teacher who treats your children poorly because of their faith. These are small-scale forms of persecution. And they're all pretty manageable, but they might happen to you. And Jesus says here that some folks will jump ship because of the persecution that they face. Why? He tells us exactly why. He says, because he has no root in himself, he is short-lived. Why do people abandon the faith? Because they have no root in themselves. Why do people put their faith away when it gets difficult? Because they have no root in themselves. And when you have no roots, you won't withstand the bad weather. So this is like what we talked about last week. We were looking at 1 John last week, and John said that they went out from us because they weren't a part of us. They went out from us because they were never really one of us. They left the faith because they were never really in the faith. And in the same way, now Jesus says he has no root in himself, so he is short-lived. So when pressure or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he stumbles. He's talking about what the New Hampshire Confession is talking about here. Perseverance of the saints. He's talking about what your Baptist grandma is talking about when she says, once saved, always saved. He's saying that when the Spirit takes hold of you, He doesn't let go. When Christ gets a hold of your heart, He keeps it. Like Jesus says in John chapter 10, He knows His sheep, and no one can pluck us from His hands. When you have no root, trials will choke out your faith. But when God's roots have grown down into the soil of your heart, they preserve you. Just like last week, this is kind of an elevator pitch as far as this concept goes, but with each passing week, we'll go over another one of the passages in Scripture that helps to illustrate and clarify what salvation looks like for us, so that with each passing week, the biblical picture of salvation will come just a little bit more clearly into view. But until next week, as always, I would like to remind you that even though we have temporarily shifted to a combination of online and drive-in services, the leadership at Mount Zion is still available to help you in any way that we are able. If you're a member of one of the groups that experts say are especially at risk for COVID-19, either because you're over 65 or you have certain pre-existing conditions that make COVID-19 particularly dangerous for you, or anything along those lines, let us know. Reach out to us and let us serve you. We are here for you insofar as we are able to be. And so, as always, until next time, we love you, we miss you, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.